Now, I wonder if before I was not actually going live because I don't know. I didn't hit the live stream button, but I don't know. We'll just sit here for a few minutes, see if anybody shows up. I had an interesting dream last night. I was at Washington State University where I went to school, and I I was working with a young physics student whose name was Planck because his parents, I don't know if his first name was Planck, and I can't remember if because I was talking to somebody else, I was like, he's really sharp, and the other student was like, yeah, he comes from a long line of physicists. Anyway, just goofy subject. And then I was explaining to him because I went to Washington State University in 93 through 95, and it was the end of the 80s. The 80s were just Washington State University was one of the top tier party schools in the United States. But for that reason, they also had problems with HIV. Per capita, it had a really high HIV rate. So it was interesting. I was pretty reclusive back then, so I wasn't engaged in a lot of sexual activity in the 90s, in the early 90s when I was in college. But it was just an interesting statistic. 10,000 kps is lower than the recommended bit rate. All right, it's after 11 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Welcome to the Heart-Centered Masterclass. I am your host, Brian Curtis. What do I have to talk about today? So what are we going to talk about today? Today we are going to talk about attachments, love, relationships, how the world is going through an identity crisis, be through attachments. A lot of times we get attached to ideas of who we are, but that's not actually who we are and what we are. And so what we're seeing in the world at large is basically identity crisis. And this shows up in a lot of different ways. I'm sure you can relate, especially when people are, naming themselves as, cats or dogs, or I am not a boy anymore, I'm a girl, or I'm not a girl anymore, I'm a boy, or I'm not either, I'm an it, whatever, because people are trying to identify with something because the group collective is going through an identity crisis. I heard a really funny story from somebody I know, and she was talking about somebody made a video. I think it was I don't know if it was in the UK or if it was in the United States, but somebody got pulled over, and the cop, for speeding, and the cop pulled him over, and he came up to the window and said, hey, I need your license registration. And the guy said, well, I actually identify as a cat, so cat doesn't need license registration to drive or something. And the cop handled it really well. He said, well, if you identify as a cat, then unfortunately you're going to have to hand over your keys because cats aren't legally allowed to drive in this state or this country or wherever it was at, and I'm gonna have to call the pound, the pest control, because we've got a cat on the loose. And the guys really shot the guy down. I guess it was pretty funny. She didn't send me the video. I'd like to watch it, but it's just a short example of some kind of identity crisis. It wouldn't be fair for me to talk about identity crisis unless I actually spoke about exactly what our identity is. And it comes down to the basis of a heart-centered broadcast, because everything comes from and goes back to the heart of any system. When we look at any system, there's always one point where everything comes from and goes back to, or the toroid. We see the toroidal field show up everywhere, because that's the only way for one point to exist in space-time. When you look at a toroid, it's swirling, it's creating two vortexes on the top and bottom, and swirling back and forth from the center point. So everything looks like a toroid, which is why it's wise to follow your heart. What is your heart telling you to do? Well, there's two aspects of the point once it becomes a toroid. Now, the point in and of itself, if you never look at anything outside the point, would be a void, because there's nothing being created from that one point. So as soon as there is a creation event, there's also an experiencing event. And so when we get down to the basics of who we are and what we are, if everything is non-local, in other words, there's no real singular point that's separate from another point because of that model in the universe, then we're all just creators and experiencers. If we attach ourselves to any part of the creation, or have some kind of attachment to want to experience one part of the creation, then it creates a false identity, if you will. And this is what we're seeing. And actually, a really good example of that is the United States recent, declaration that they want Greenland. And Greenland, interestingly enough, from the people that live there, they don't own the land. They don't have unhealthy attachments to think that you can own a piece of property. Now, you can write everything down and create borders and all that stuff, but as soon as you die, you're going to find out that you didn't own anything. So what was the point? Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting to experience everything, and ideally, we would want to experience everything together if we can get to that point where we understand that we are the creator and experiencer. And if it's non-local, then I no longer have an attachment to me as an individual, but what's the group experience? What are the experience that I'm going through and the people that I'm interacting with? When you think about your life, it's usually a collection of memories of your interactions, not a collection of memories of just you. It's always an interaction or the relationship with your environment that is part of your memory. This is just another evidence of how and what we are. Because if it's non-local and there is just one creator, then naturally our experiences are going to be that one of relation of how we're interacting versus any one thing. If you were, no man is an island, no woman is an island. That statement is and isn't false because if there's just one thing and we're just experiencing ourselves through an infinite number of different relationships with ourselves, whether you're sitting next to a tree and you can feel the peace coming from the tree, or you can, or your animal, your dogs, your cats, you're experiencing a relationship of how they want to get closer to, how we want to get closer to one another. And we get closer through a sense of peace, not a feeling of a need or a longing. Because when there's a need or a longing there, then there's an attachment, and then that you're constantly feeding that dopamine response to create that longing. Very fine balance. You want to be able to experience one another without the need to experience one another. Because or any specific part, there's always going to be a need to experience yourself, and yourself is everything. But if you're attached to one portion of it, then it can lead to dysfunction. Now, there's also the fact that we resonate. We generally find people that we resonate with more, and so I wouldn't view that as a negative attachment if you're resonating with somebody more than you're resonating with other people. It's just that they're at a level of self-awareness close to your own levels of self-awareness that is easier to deal with, so you're not constantly having to ground out negative emotional attachments when you're when you're with that person or those people. Big subject. And so from the yogi's perspective, and this is how we're ascending as a consciousness, once you move past the attachment phase, and yogis do this, there's lots of historical evidence that, and witness testimonies that say yogis that are living in Nepal or places where it's very cold, it shows them sitting down and they can throw cold, wet towels on these guys when it's like 25 degrees Fahrenheit, or let's say -5 Celsius. And these yogis are able to actually steam the water off the towels off of their backs, and they're wearing practically nothing, and changing their own internal body temperature to do that. How do they do that? That's the first question. And it comes from long periods of meditation where you're detaching from the exterior senses and producing your own senses independent of what you're getting. This is the creation event. If you're the creator and the experiencer, you don't have to be tied to the experience. You can actually experience something and then manipulate the field by creating a new feeling in the body, because everything's non-local. But most everything that you look at is not self-aware. But once the level of self-awareness gets high enough that you can create your own state of being, regardless of whatever energy is being projected in the area, you can both experience the energy that's being projected and then change it from a creative aspect to become whatever you want. This is how healing works, and how healing of the body works, where Jesus and other ascended masters were able to and teach this through the Gospel of Thomas, and other people have talked about this, like Greg Braden in a recent talk that he talked about the Gospel of Thomas and how to heal the body, where you're actually creating a thought, a word from the heart, the mouth speaks, and an emotional feeling that it's already happened, of what you're picturing in your mind has already happened. So you're marrying the emotional aspects and the masculine aspects of the mind for a creation event, while also recognizing the experience that's in front of you. Very powerful. And this is how you heal the body. We call it healing, but all you're doing is changing the momentum of from being strictly the experiencer to the creator. When you're actively creating, you're aligning yourself with the creation event, because everything is being created. There's nothing that isn't being created. And when you look at biblical testimonies and how things are, obviously, if it's non-local, then it's coming from one source, then there's one creator. If you can actively create, you'll come more in alignment with the higher creation, the non-local creation. Excuse me. And so creators that are having a larger and larger impact on their environment, it's a very interesting, it becomes a very spiritual thing. Imagine somebody like James Cameron, whose creative works have had more and more impact on society, what it's like for someone to get pulled into more and more of the creative aspect and change the momentum of thought patterns in the group collective, because you're becoming more aligned with what's actually happening around you. So very interesting to think about. I mean, most people don't even think about it, but what it's like for somebody that has had a large impact, then the ego has a tendency to inflate. But if there's actually just one ego, the idea is to have everybody become a part of the creative process. So the last portion that I want to deal with here is part of my intent, my projects. When we look at organisms and how they evolve, they're actually moving more information and energy from the field. Well, how do they do that? They do that through the DNA structure. Because if everything is just non-local awareness, then you want to both capture the information, or the experience that's going on there, and then have it, as much of what you capture, be able to connect in series or in parallel so that you can move that information and change that information. So you're both changing the information at the same time and moving it and then capturing it. It's a DNA strand or a ladder diagram. In electrical diagrams, we see the same thing. An electrical diagram is basically just a parallel circuit of capacitance. You've got rows and rows and rows that are all connected in a line, which means that all the information and the experience that you're capturing can instantaneously be shared and changed by everything that's attached to it. So ideally, the linear portion is just how it's connected, and then on the horizontal is how we're experiencing the groups. So they're just groups of amino acids that are connected in parallel to make sure all the information from any rung is instantaneously shared with every other rung on the ladder. That's the most efficient way to both create capacitance and motion. Because capacitance in and of itself is not moving, but if you connect all the capacitance linearly without any kind of hierarchy, then it naturally forms an organism that emulates something more profound, if that makes sense. So the human DNA strand is one of the most complex that we see on the planet for that reason, because we're moving more information and energy in the body. And because we're doing that, we're actually having more of a creative event or a more creative impact on our environment, which is why we see, if we're not corrected, connected in a really healthy relationship, it can have a detrimental effect on our environment. We're creating waste because we're creating hierarchical systems that are centrally controlled that emulate a virus instead of a healthy DNA ladder type DNA strand. People have tried to build groups, but if you're not emulating that simple structure, then it'll always fall into some kind of dysfunction. If you're making groups too big, then they break down and they become centralized in and of themselves, and then they become kind of a cult instead of emulating a natural DNA strand or a natural healthy building blocks of an organism. I've covered a lot today, and I don't currently have any viewers for the video, so I'm gonna end it here. And you guys can feel free to reach out to me at bcurtis@bcurtis.org, or any other way to get information, or if you want to just speak about these subjects. When we fall into a false identity of who we are, it always leads to dysfunctional relationships. If I believe that I'm something that I'm not, or it comes from some kind of attachment, and then my emotions are directly tied to whatever that attachment is. Because if I fall into a poor emotional state, if I don't have this, or I don't have that, or if I don't look the way I want to, or if it all comes to the way we feel about ourselves and how. And our understanding of ourselves. And it can be too easy to fall into unhealthy emotional feelings of ourselves and the people around us because of false identity. And your identity isn't anything that's tied to time for that reason. If you're the creator and the experiencer, then all of us have the ability to understand us as that identity, and then change the momentum of any moment of what we're doing and how we're creating and how we're experiencing things. It's the root cause of suffering, is if we don't understand who we are and what we are. So, love you guys, because I don't have any choice. It's one thing, because if consciousness is on local, then you are me and I am you anyway. So it's impossible for me not to. Love is just a formula for that interaction. And we don't, every interaction is actually, when you think about it, it's a point of love, because if there's we're creating a false identity and a resistance, then we're forced to break that down, or else we cause ourselves harm, literally. So I'll end it there. It's 20 minutes. These have been going about 20 minutes. So love you guys. Have a great day, and I'll catch you on the next time.